Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Today I want to share with you all about the Bandhas in quite a broad exploration. We'll look at how the Bandhas are first talked about in the Patanjali Yoga Sutras and how they develop from an understanding of what it means for the prana to be channeled to help with pranayama and meditation, through to our understanding today, which is a much more physical concept often of how to support the physical body and make lightness in the body through, for example, the use of Uddiyana Bandha. And then I'd really like to tie in some of what we now understand about the nervous system and just how significant the Bandhas can be to a relatively recent understanding of the nervous system, which includes an emphasis on the vagus nerve. So we'll have a look back at the term bandha, which comes from pand in the Sanskrit, and that's often translated as lock or to lock. We can also think of it as any way to capture or hold or enchain, and so it can have this double connotation of stopping, but also of binding together, of coming together. So we see this definition in the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, which is sometimes now called the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, saying that the original sutra text and the commentary actually came together at the same time, potentially by Patanjali. And he uses this term to describe the three higher limbs of yoga, or the internal limbs of yoga, they're sometimes called. So concentration, dharana, dhyana, which is meditation, and samadhi. Chapter 3, verse 1, Desha bandhas chittasya dharana. And so it's saying that concentration is the binding of consciousness to a particular object. So we have that term pand as a way of tying together consciousness with a particular object, and that this is the essence of concentration. And so the binding of the bandha work, in this sense, can actually offer an ultimate release from our bound earthly existence. We can check and alter the flow of prana and redistribute, reorganize the prana through this process of bandha, or we could think of it as abandha, because when we put the A in front of the term in Sanskrit, we get to the opposite, so to unbind ourselves. So the sutras are considered now usually to be a 5th century text through the research of a lot of the yoga historians, in particular the work of Mas. So later on, when we come to the medieval period, which is where we have the flourishing of Hatha Yoga, we see the term coming more into use in relation to practices on the physical level. So really we see the Tantra development around about the 9th to the 13th century, and then after that we're talking more into the development of the Hatha Yoga, meaning this forceful yoga. So perhaps the most interesting sense that we have in this also is that ability to unlock this freedom within the mind, within the consciousness, but also to use the prana in a sense to transform our experience of the body from something quite earthly and bound to something more light and potentially more transformative, so that we feel ourselves more interconnected with that prana, experience ourselves perhaps more as pranic beings. So when we look later on still to BKS Iyengar of Iyengar Yoga in the 1970s in Light on Yoga, he describes that while practicing Mula Bandha, the yogi attempts to reach the true source or mula of creation. So that term mula relating to Mula Bandha or the root chakra, Muladhara chakra, often translated as root or sometimes as earth. So we have that sense of moving from constriction to an experience of space in the physical and in the psychic fields. The true meaning, and I quote here from Swami Puttananda, the true meaning of Bandha is essentially paradoxical. By locking or contracting certain muscles on the physical level, a subtle process of unlocking goes on simultaneously on mental and pranic levels. So we lock on the physical, we contract, we engage, and this enables an unlocking on the other levels. So what's really interesting, I think, is that often when we see this term prana and we consider what's happening with the nervous system, we can find a relationship. We can say that this process that's happening on the physical level is affecting the nervous system, and that this could ultimately tie in to that sense of freedom, to that sense of stimulating and regulating the flow of prana. So we're going to then look at a definition from the medieval period, from about a 10th century text called Yoga Taravali. And this text by Adi Shankaracharya describes Jalanthara Bandha, Uddiyana Bandha, and Mula Bandha are situated respectively in the throat, abdomen, and perineum. If their duration can be increased, then where is the fear of death? So we have Jalanthara Bandha, sometimes it's just called the chin lock. We lift the chest, bring the chin down. Uddiyana Bandha, the abdominal area, the diaphragm uplifts, and Mula Bandha, engagement or stimulation in the pelvis, in the pelvic floor. And this description then that this understanding, this work with the bandhas, this ability to maintain the bandhas will help us overcome any fear of death. We realize ourselves to not just be this physical entity, but to have some aspect of self which carries on beyond this defined lifetime. So if we then consider what is it that can be so powerful in this way, so transformative, perhaps it makes sense to say what's having this profound effect on the mental state and on our perception of self could actually be the vagus nerve, or this could be one aspect of it from a more modern perspective. The vagus nerve is one of the cranial nerves. It's the 10th cranial nerve, so it's coming out of your brain and down into the body. And then it carries information from the body back to the brain. So that means it's got afferent fibers with an A, and 80% of its fibers are afferent fibers. And interestingly, the vagus nerve travels through all of the areas associated with the bandhas. And so when we work with the bandhas, we're stimulating the vagus nerve. And the really important thing about that is that the vagus nerve is the main nerve for the parasympathetic system. So that means it's the main nerve that helps us to feel more at ease or more relaxed. The work of Stephen Porges, who wrote all about the vagus nerve and a theory called polyvagal theory. So in other words, the vagus nerve having different branches and different functions, poly meaning many. His work really shows us just how significant it can be to understand the vagus, because while the whole nervous system altogether determines how we feel, how we experience things, what kind of thoughts are coming up, how the body's working, how the muscles are working, the vagus nerve in particular seems to be so significant in our general state of being, our general sense of being alert or afraid, all of these different states, whereas we used to have an understanding of the sympathetic, often called fight, flight, and then the parasympathetic, often called rest and digest. We now have a much more nuanced, complex picture of the nervous system, and I will attempt to tie it all together with the bandhas. So the polyvagal theory, there's quite a lot tied into that. It's quite a complex theory, and it's really worth having a look at the work of Stephen Porges, because yoga has been shown to have a massive impact on the vagus nerve, and that's through quite a lot of different mechanisms. So things like movement and noticing that we're moving through yoga asana, moving in time with the breath, chanting or singing, doesn't have to be yoga chanting, we can't claim it all, breath work, pranayama, mindfulness, noticing our thoughts, all of these things can have an impact on the nervous system in general, but also quite specifically on the vagus nerve. Perhaps the most significant finding of the polyvagal theory, it's still a theory, it's still being worked on, is that instead of this sympathetic, parasympathetic kind of seesaw that we often describe and often learn about, parasympathetic being the more relaxation response which yoga supports, the polyvagal theory says there's more than that. There's also these hybrid states, and there's a hierarchy of states. So we start off in a state which is sometimes described as social engagement, and that means that the ventral side of the vagus nerve is being stimulated. So we can just divide the vagus nerve into the ventral and the dorsal. The ventral leaves the brain slightly further forward, and the dorsal, meaning back in French, is slightly further back. And so when we're in this social engagement state, that means we're just in our normal, everyday, happy kind of state, willing to kind of meet and greet, and unless something gives us a shock or a fear, we'll stay in that social engagement state. But if something kind of goes a little bit wrong, or we kind of are feeling a bit wary, then we go more into that sympathetic nervous system state that we think of as fight or flight. And then the polyvagal theory then jumps back in to say, but if that then becomes not tenable, if we can't get away, and if we can't fight successfully, we might just freeze, and then we will go into a kind of state of shutdown. And so this is then the dorsal vagus nerve state. So he's describing the vagus nerve as giving us this alternative states, the social engagement and then this freeze state. And then that might also progress into a fawn response, where if our freezing, trying to have this mammalian response, mammal response of maybe it won't eat me if I just pretend I'm dead, if that fails, then we could also go along with our attacker, whatever situation that is. It just can be a situation where we feel under attack. It doesn't mean we're necessarily physically under attack. And so this would then be another part of the dorsal response. But there's also these hybrid responses. So instead of it being so clear cut, I could, for example, be socially engaged, enjoying myself. I'm out dancing and having fun with my friends, but I'm also in a sympathetic nervous system state. So the sympathetic nervous system is not just fight or flight. It's not all negative. It's also good times, the happy times. Or I could be cuddling up with my child or resting with a partner, feeling kind of really still, really mellow. So that's dorsal, but it doesn't mean I'm necessarily frozen. It could mean that I'm just really calm. So I've got this mode of being that's very calm, very still, but I'm still content. So I'm actually not frozen, but I do have that immobilization response. So we have a much more nuanced picture of the nervous system. The reason it's so significant also is because some people can get stuck in a more fight-flight response, as we know, but it could also be that we could get stuck in that kind of freeze response, or some of those dorsal vagal responses where we're kind of a bit shut off. And that can be the case for people with different neurodiversity, so people on the autism spectrum, for example. It can also be the case for people who have experienced some trauma. So understanding this can be really useful to us, for ourselves, and also just in general for our friends and family, because of course so many people can be a little bit stuck in these ways. So if the vagus nerve is offline, if we're feeling more in fight or flight or more in a frozen kind of response like dorsal vagus nerve response, then we're not getting stimulus through the vagus nerve so much. And so it's hard to shift out of that response. But we can see that if the bandhas are working directly into those areas where the vagus nerve is traveling, then we can support some stimulus of the vagus nerve, and we can create some positive shift in our mental health and in our daily lives. The term vagus actually means wanderer from the German, and so that's because the nerve does do this whole wandering through the body. It has many branches and branchlets that kind of travel off all the way down from the brain, through the throat, hence Jalandhara Bandha, hence also why singing and chanting can be influential on the vagus nerve, through the diaphragm, so through the respiratory tract, which uplifts in Uddiyana Bandha, through the abdomen, so through your guts also, and then down into the pelvis. And so it's also responsible for giving sexual pleasure or giving that information of sexual pleasure from the body back to the brain. But also we can see that with the uplift of Mula Bandha, we'll also be stimulating the vagus nerve. So from a physical level, often we're familiar with the bandhas to support our yoga asana practice. Mula Bandha, or the root lock, is usually described as a contraction, a lifting up in the pelvic floor muscles. It actually gets described differently in different places, and for men and for women. There are two bandhas in the pelvic area, or two different groups of muscles which we can contract, which get described differently anyway. So if you look at the muscles of the pelvic floor, you can see it as being two triangles, the front triangle and the back triangle. And so the front triangle, essentially more around the urethra area, and the back triangle more around the anus area. And so with Mula Bandha, you're coming more or less to the middle region for an uplift. It's not just the uplift around the anus, which gets described separately as Ashwini Mudra. And that means the gesture, the mudra of the horse. If you've ever had the luxury of going horse riding, or less the luxury of just seeing a horse have a poo, they do have very impressive anal sphincters, and you can see this incredible movement of their lovely velvety anuses kind of coming in and out. And so you can see why they gave that term for the Ashwini Mudra there, so you can have that uplift there. But Mula Bandha would be more further forward in the pelvic floor and uplift. In men, it gets described as a lift from the perineum, so from the more superficial region. And in women, it's often described as being up at the cervix. So you travel up the vagina, and then at the top of the vagina, there's the cervix, and you'd be feeling more for an uplift from there. And some texts will describe it as there being a need to really perfect the technique. It's not enough to just do a great big, like, crunching up, imagining you never need to wee or poo again. It's not really going to cut it. It's a more refined, delicate uplift. An image that I personally find useful is to imagine that you have a candle and you blow out the candle, and that kind of delicacy of the smoke from the candle is that sense of uplift from the base. Often we also get told that we need Mula Bandha to support the physical body, and there's quite a lot of cautionary language in Hatha Yoga, or in physical yoga, which gets used. More recently, the work of biomechanics has shown that we don't really need this cautionary language so much around the body. The pelvic floor muscles will tend to take care of themselves unless there's a situation where something does need addressing, and then some kind of bandha practice might actually be useful. But of course, the key thing to understand about any muscle is that we want to be able to use its full range of movement. So if I asked you to always contract your bicep and you spent your life like this, or between here and here, you would obviously give quite specific information to the nervous system that it didn't need to do more than that, and it would probably get hypertonic, hypertoned. And it's exactly the same with the pelvic floor. If we always go trying to uplift, it doesn't actually have its full function anymore. It won't be able to release down and then lift up. So we don't want to always go contracting Mula Bandha. We want to have the full range of expression in the pelvic floor muscles, the full range of movement, just as we would with any other muscles. When we practice pranayama, it can be really useful to use the bandhas, and if you do enjoy breathwork, I would suggest working gently with the bandhas and just seeing what quality of stability that might bring. And similarly, when we bring the chin down towards the chest in Jalandhara Bandha, we can have this great big sense perhaps of that serpent hood coming up and over and bringing about that real sense of calm. But of course, now that we understand the vagus nerve, we can also say, we can use this this amazing imagery of the yogis and this language, this symbolic language from the yogis, but we can also know, oh, I'm stimulating the vagus, and so therefore it feels very calming, and that can help us shift into deeper meditative states. Uddiyana Bandha, the term ut means to uplift, and with the Uddiyana Bandha, essentially what we're really doing is we're uplifting the diaphragm muscle, which attaches the whole way around your rib cage. So when you've had a full exhalation, then there's more space to have that uplift of the diaphragm. And in that moment, the abdominal wall can also recede back towards the spine. So there's some sense in which we're tonifying, giving a little bit of a work to the core muscles, or even perhaps to some extent tonifying the organs underneath, although this has not really been researched thoroughly to say exactly what effect it's having, as far as I understand. So that uplift on the physical level, when we're practicing our yoga asana, in a sense can be useful, using the abdominal muscles well, using the pelvic floor muscles well for Mula Bandha. It can give a sense of lightness to the practice for your arm balances or your handstands, etc. But again, on a more subtle level, for the pranayama or for the meditation practice, we don't need to go pulling the abdomen all the way back towards the spine, and nor do we, of course, in the asana practice. So we can think in the asana practice of that length over the whole of the abdomen, say in a full back bend, Urdhva Dhanurasana, upward bow pose. We can think of that as being an Uddiyana Bandha, this length over that whole abdominal area. Or we could also think of those moments when we're holding the breath, retaining the breath, and then we could have full Uddiyana Bandha. And so again, it's quite a varied term. It has quite a lot of different meanings. When we hold the breath completely, either on the inhalation or on the exhalation, this can help to still the mind. There's that sense of connection between the breath and the movements of the mind, which gets described time and again in the yoga texts. But with Uddiyana Bandha, it would have to be after the exhalation that we hold the breath. The Sanskrit term sometimes used is bahir kumbhaka. So we're doing a kumbhaka, a holding of the breath after the bahir, after the exhalation. That's quite a challenging practice, but it is one that, again, is really worth using. It can have a very transformational effect. And generally, we just do it 2 or 3 or 4 times, not like lots and lots of times in a row. So that's a little bit about the method of Uddiyana Bandha. And then, of course, Jalandhara Bandha, which I've mentioned already. It's sometimes described as this capturing in the net, the jala, this water component around the throat also. And with this, there's 2 actions. There's the uplift of the chest before we bring the chin down. And then there's a sense that that's sealing the prana at the top of the tube. The Mula Bandha is holding the prana stable at the base. And then the Uddiyana is allowing that free flowing of the prana along the tube. The tube, of course, if you're wondering, being Sushumna Nadi, so that central channel for the prana or for the Kundalini. But similarly, we can think of all sorts of tubes that run up and down that central channel. You've got the spine, you've got great plexi of nerves, arteries, you've got a line of organs going on, etc. But for the yogis, they describe tubes, and even within tubes, greater refinement of tubes for the Kundalini or for the prana. And so we have this sense that the yogis are describing this whole passageway of prana or of Kundalini and how to stimulate that so as to have a really ability to trace our awareness back to the source, to feel totally interconnected. And nowadays we can relate all of that back to the lines of the nerves, the central channels of the nerves, of the spine, and to the ability to realize perhaps altered states of consciousness, but more than that, to live every day with a greater sense of ease, a greater sense perhaps of social engagement, as Stephen Porges would term it, or of being safe within ourselves and with each other, which is really fundamental to the human experience. So I hope this has been useful to tie in some of the older ideas or concepts of yoga and practices with a modern day interpretation of these practices and of why they might work and why they might really still be valid today, even though we know other ways to stimulate the vagus nerve. I imagine that the Bandhas might have a bit of a revival in their fuller understanding, because to my experience and those of my trainees that I work with, it can be very powerful to use these methods. Thank you for sharing with me today. If you'd like to know more about what I do, please do join up for the mailing list, and I will be offering more information, more vlogs and more blogs on my social media and as well as in my newsletters. Go to the website to sign up, or follow me also on social media. At Laura Gilmore Yoga is my Instagram handle, and at Bristol School of Yoga is my teacher training school. Thank you.